with the Ukrainian Institute and Birkbeck College, Center for Museum Cultures. And it forms part of the Ukrainian season in the UK, which is organized under the auspices of the British Council. And the British Council, who's represented here by David Codling, and very generously sponsors us. So we are incredibly grateful for that. And if the first day was largely devoted to concepts of decolonization and practices of decolonizations, we also included some important presentations about actually the practices of colonization. And we had a chilling report from what is going on in the museum in Luhansk, which was very moving and alerting us to what is going on in Ukraine and in the Ukrainian museums. And this day is going to be continuation of those practices of decolonization in Ukrainian museums, and we are going to be taken again to the Khanenko Museum in Kyiv, and to the Museum of Fine Arts in Odessa. So I would like, and the chair of our meetings the chair for today is Tetyana Filevska, who's, I mean, we came together with the same idea, and it was a very fortunate meeting that we will organize such an event together. So Tetyana, I may say that she doesn't need any introduction, especially to those who have attended the session yesterday, but I will just say a few words about her. She's, as we know, creative director of the Ukrainian Institute in London, which is based in London. And she's a specialist in the field of contemporary art. And her research focuses on the Ukrainian art of the 20th century. And she has been curating many art projects. Apart from that, and what I get from her, from Tetyana's CV, is that she's a cultural activist, and I like that term very much. She is a graduate of the Flex Exchange program, which has been funded by the US government. But apart from that, she graduated with honors from the Faculty of Philosophy of the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv. And she worked in various institutions, Eidos Foundation Center for Contemporary Art, in the Center for Contemporary Art Foundation, in the Izolacja, Platform for Cultural Initiatives, in the Mistecki means artistic, Mistecki Arsenal team on the educational and public program of the first Kyiv International Biennale of Contemporary Art, Arsenale 2012. And she is now curating a public program of the Ukrainian pavilion at the at the Ukrainian pavilion at the 59th Venice Biennale, which is dedicated to decolonization. She's an author of several books, and the most important ones are the book on Kazimir Malevich, his activity in the Kyiv period, 1928 to 1930, and I'm very interested in this book personally. And the second book is called Dmitro. It was published in Ukrainian. I think both of them were published. No, perhaps the Kazimir Malevich, there is also an English version. And Dmitro Gorbachev, the second book is Dmitro Gorbachev, Sluchai, which means Dmitro Gorbachev case studies. And I have learned about Dmitro Gorbachev. Don't confuse him with Mikhail Gorbachev, of course. Dmitro Gorbachev is a scholar of Ukrainian art who devoted his life to the presentation, study, and popularization of an almost lost page of Ukrainian art. So, and the book is the book contains testimonies of how the study of Ukrainian avant-garde began, which is very, very important also for our program. So, Tetyana, I'm passing the mic, virtual mic to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katarzyna. Well, now you know everything about me, but I just would like to make a little correction that I'm actually creative director at the Ukrainian Institute, which is based in Kyiv, though I myself now temporary is replaced and I live in London, but that's temporary, and the institute is based in Kyiv because there is a Ukrainian Institute in London, which is a separate entity. Our partners, great friends, but a different institution. So I don't work there. I work for the Kyiv. Because our institution is the public institution which is affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and we are officially responsible for cultural diplomacy on Ukrainian side. And as you already know, we are starting the second day of the series of discussions, Mapping Ukraine in the Museum World, Collections and Practices. And yesterday we focused mostly on the theoretical, but not only, but of the aspect of the decolonization process of museum institutions. And today we'll continue and focus more on the state of Ukrainian museums in the aftermath of war and the opportunities and the needs and follow-up steps that can be taken by both Ukrainian and international museums. Before we jump into the discussion, we will speak more. I will introduce more our participants. I would like to thank people, our partners and colleagues who made this event possible. And I would like to thank David Codling, the British Council's Global Arts Portfolio Advisor, Director of the Ukraine season of the British Council that are sponsoring this event. Stephanie Bowery, who moderated yesterday's event, Director of the Center of Museum Cultures at Birkbeck. My colleague at the Ukrainian Institute, Anastasia Yevseyeva, Head of Visual Culture, and Katarzyna Murawska-Muthesius, Honorary Research Fellow of Birkbeck College, member of the Steering Committee of the Center of Museum College, Birkbeck. And I'm very grateful to all the speakers, including professionals from Ukraine and the international community, and we are very honored to have you with us. And thank you so much for joining this event, all the guests who are joining us online in this discussion, and a small technical announcement that we are broadcasted on the Zoom platform. And the video can be also seen at Facebook page of the Ukrainian Institute, and we will record it. And together with the subtitles, both in English and Ukrainian, you will be able to see this record afterwards. Before we jump in actually into the discussion, I would like to ask David to join us and share your words, your thoughts on the importance of this event. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tetyana. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and alongside our partners, the Ukrainian Institute in the UK-Ukraine season. This endeavor is very much a partnership between us, and I also want to thank Birkbeck College and Dr. Murawska-Muthesius for this opportunity to collaborate in this very interesting and important discussion. A couple of words, first of all, about the UK-Ukraine season, for those of you who are less familiar with it. It was originally conceived 2 years ago, very much in partnership between the British Council and the Ukrainian Institute, as a reflection and a celebration of cultural exchange between our two countries. And that was on the occasion of 3 decades since Ukraine's re-emergence as an independent country. Now, of course, the circumstances were somewhat different then, but the title of the season, Future Reimagined, was from that time, and it has been retained because it's taken on a new and very special, especially urgent meaning since the last invasion in February 2022. And so the season proceeds somewhat changed in its modes of delivery, with more activity happening in the UK than was originally planned, but still very much with the same purpose in mind, which is an exploration shared between artists and organizations from both countries of the transformative power of culture. Ukraine is facing an explicit and deliberate attack on its culture, and response to that on all fronts is in Ukraine itself, inspires admiration and also requires the solidarity of all of us who value freedom. And in the museum, in the museum sector and the cultural sector, the cultural heritage sector more widely, this has a particular significance because the attacks on the attacks on and the distortion, one might say, of cultural heritage are always a huge danger. Well, they're also an area of contention in so many places. Museums are always politically charged spaces, always and everywhere. They are, in a sense, also leading citizens in their community, and that makes them in many ways, it gives them huge responsibility. It also makes them vulnerable, and especially in a situation where a country is under attack. Museums are also protagonists of international cultural research and scholarship and exchange, and that's one of the particularly valuable aspects of this collaboration that we have as part of the Ukraine season, which is, we hope to be an important expression of solidarity and practical collaboration between the UK and Ukraine at this time. I will stop there once again, saying what an honor and a pleasure it is to be with you, and to thank again Dr. Murawska-Muthesius and her colleagues and all of the other partners, and Birkbeck University of London. And I'll look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Great to have you today with us, and thank you for the inspiring words of this day. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker. So we will have Yuliia Vaganova today with us, who will present a paper titled Museums Strategies During the War, Reinventing Itself. Yuliia Vaganova is an art historian, art manager, curator, and she's currently an acting director of the Bogdan and Varvara Khanenko National Museum of Arts in Kyiv, Ukraine. Before that, she was deputy director for exhibitions and museum projects at Mistetsky Arsenal, Art Arsenal, Ukraine's largest art platform, art facility. And before that, she was deputy director for exhibitions, partnerships, and international projects at the National Art Museum of Ukraine. She also directed the Center for Contemporary Arts at Kyiv Mohila Academy, and in her various institutional roles, she has participated in strategic development, as well as the implementation of education programs and various museums exhibitions. Yuliia initiated and has led a number of training programs focused on developing arts institution transformation processes, communication strategies, as well as promoting museums. In the summer of 2022, she took part in a research program with German university partners exhibiting the Khanenko Museum Kyiv, a haunting photographic portrait of the museum's empty rooms. Yuliia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tetyana. Good evening, everyone. I know that this is an academic way of talking about the floor is mine, and that I have a paper. To be honest, we used to think about museums as an academic institution, which are changing slowly, and presentation about its activity could be used the same for months or even years. I have to change my presentation 2 times during these 3 weeks, not because I was not prepared, but because the events were so that I have to change it all the time. So I will start my my presentation with the history of museum, but before I would like to make some yes, people will colleagues will help me with the presentation, with the sliding. But before, I would like to remind all of us that museums are institutions that store evidence of facts, which then form an objective memory that claims to be a collective memory. Museums keep testimonies that do not allow rewriting and creating myths. And we are, museum institutions that shape the objective reality of the past and present. Because these, museums are also scientific institutions based on facts. If the evidence of the past is being erased, actually what is going now in Ukraine, then in our culture and history appears gaps, which are filled by others or could be filled by others. A person loses his roots, he, she, or they find themselves in so-called, I don't know, nowhere, in limbo, but not because, of course, of original sin. And when they don't know who they are, then they become an object of the manipulation. So that's why actually working in the museum and thinking about what a museum is doing right now and used to do before, this is very important for nowadays. So Khanenko Museum. Khanenko Museum, it's one of the largest museum in the city center. It's loved by people, of course, because of its historical interiors and very great collection of art. May I have the next slide, please? This is one of the buildings of Khanenko Museum. It was built by founders, Bogdan and Varvara Khanenko, in the end of the 19th century. And the building was built on purpose to put the collection which founders gathered during the many years. They didn't have children, so all collection by the will of the founders have to go to the city. They would like to grant the collection to the city. It was never open as a public museum before. Next slide, please. It was open like a private collection, and people could see it like a guest of the house. So here you could see the founders of the museum, Bogdan Khanenko and Varvara Khanenko. Varvara Khanenko is a daughter of Tetyana family, which is also very well known as the biggest philanthropist and biggest founders of many cultural institutions and helped with the organization and supporting many other institutions. Also, for example, universities, hospitals, different educational institutions as well. So it was actually in front, and it was in family, and very good traditions in the family to get the art and to support the art and culture actually. So they started the collection first as amateurs, but then they decided to really be professionals in this, and they visited all the time. They visited many times Europe, also Cairo, also other countries to get the objects into collection. Next slide, please. If we're talking about the museum and institution, we have to mention that Bogdan Khanenko was also one of the co-founders of the National Art Museum of Ukraine, because actually his archaeology collection was granted to the National Art Museum. It was called Muzey Starożytności, which was built in 1899. But this is also show us it also shows us how important was this people and this couple for the city, because pointed not only on the private collection, but also wanted to build the wider landscape and cultural landscape in Kyiv. Actually, Bogdan's idea was that this museum, Ukrainian National Art Museum, has to be the world museum, with a museum of all over the world. But other people from the committee decided that it has to be concentrated on the local culture, and he agreed that it was important, and then later decided to build his own museum. Next slide, please. So here we could see the archive photos from the Khanenko, from the museum. This photo is between 1914, 1919, and here we could see how actually the family put the collection all together. And what was interesting for all of us, that actually it was not divided on European art, for example, and Asian art. It was not divided north or south. All objects were all together. We don't know if it was because of the mess, or because of no space, or because they would like to have it, but we found that such a presentation of the different projects from different contexts is very interesting and is very important for Ukraine. We have, after the next slide, please. Okay, another one. All the photos are archived, so you could see how the pictures were put it in this building. Next slide, please. Yes, actually, we have different works in collection, like Western European and Asian art. Next slide. It's just to have an idea about the collection. And during the period when Bogdan and Varvara Khanenko put the artworks in the museum, next slide, please, it was not divided on the West European, for example, and Asian art. This division was created in Soviet time when the part of the collection was, here you see that this is Mongolian art, and also from Spain, from China, and from Japan. So really very, very wide collection and different collections. And next slide will also show you some other. Not all objects in the collection were purchased by Bogdan and Varvara Khanenko. The collection was widened after the 20s as well. But when Soviets nationalized the museum, the collection was partly divided by type of the art, let's say. For example, we went to the historical museum, some decorative art to the Museum of Applied Art, some icons to the Russian Museum, and so on. This was quite typical for the Soviet time, when they not keep the old collection, but which was organized gathered by founders in one place, but wanted to distribute collection and actually to split the collections. Also, after Soviets came, the names of the Bogdan and Varvara Khanenko were erased from the memory of the museum, and the museum came back retaken this name only in 90s, after the independence of Ukraine. I would like to mention that because of these two people, I mean Varvara and Bogdan Khanenko, and thanks to incredible braveness of Varvara, this collection actually appeared in Kyiv, because during 1917 and 1918, where it was a very difficult time in Kyiv, and it also was quite hot when and civil war, Varvara was proposed to move with a collection on the west, but she rejected and she decided to stay in Kyiv. But that time, Bogdan Khanenko already has died. He died in 1917. Varvara was 66 years old and left with two assistants alone in Kyiv, with absolutely no understanding about the future, but with the decision to stay with the collection and to give the collection to the city and to the people who are living here. That's why we have this collection today in Kyiv. And that's why we're talking about the important role of the person and important role of the institution, which gives you a lot of possibilities then to develop the local culture, to have an influence of many processes which are running in the city and in the country. Next slide, please. Yes, here you could see the one of the rooms, gold cabinet of the museum. Museum has historical interiors. I mean, this building has historical interiors. It divided in several rooms, and each separate room has his own. So presented his own epoch. I'm sorry for this, not for this pause. So if we will go further, after the 2000, actually in the middle of 2000, in museum we've got another building which is nearby, and after that the presentation of the collection was divided into parts. One part, the Western European part of the collection, stay in the original building of Khanenko, and another part goes to another building which is nearby. These buildings are connected in between with a tiny corridor, and you could go through this corridor to one part, from one part of the museum to another part of the museum. This actually dividing the division actually between the West and Asia, especially in Khanenko Museum, where we don't have Ukrainian art, could be even symbolic, because you could try to find yourself all the time in this tiny corridor, moving from Western part to the Asian part and back. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is one of the, back. Thank you. This is part of the Asian collection, and here's the workshop of one of our colleagues with the children. So if you talk about the museum before the war, so we can see that this is a museum with full standards, with many children's programs, with the inclusive programs, with the publications, with many professionals and scientists who are making their own academic research in museum, and who is working in museum and also writing PhD and so on, who are really working with collection and trying to research the collection. Quite academic, traditional, but also very sensitive to the request of the time institution. What has happened actually after 24th of February? Next slide, please. Here you could see the museum after 24th of February. This day we dismount the exposition of the museum, all things which we could dismount and which museum staff, where the mainly women could move actually from the walls. And next 2 days we're trying to hide. Here you could see also the rooms of the Asian part of the exposition. So all vitrines are empty and all objects are packed and moved in safe place. We were doing it several days. Next slide, please. And didn't know actually what will happen next another day. Part of our staff, of our team, moved in another country, and they're now doing research into academic programs in Europe, or in mostly in Europe actually. And we're all the time online with them, but nevertheless, of course, it's quite difficult for a museum to work when the team is split. So you not only don't have the classical exposition, which you could use every day and show to visitors, but you also don't have the team, which is part of which are not in Kyiv now. So what museum can do in such a situation when objects are already packed, and when actually you don't know if it's safe or not safe to let people go in the museum, and when objects are already described many times, or when it's impossible to make further research because you don't have access to the objects actually to make such a research. So what you have to do with such a situation with the museum? We were thinking about it, let's say, till the middle of May. Next slide, please. And actually this time, approximately middle of May or beginning of June, we start our program. So we decided to reinvent the museum. We didn't put such a task for ourselves, but it just happened. And we started to work within the museum like an institution and trying to talk about the museum, not about like only collection, but about the institution. This is an exhibition which flyer from this exhibition was done in Technische Universität Dortmund. It was a proposal to make photo exhibition of our museum and put them in Technische University in Dortmund. Not to put the destroyed building, not to put the crashed building, but to put the empty museum, which could be a symbol of the fragility, but also at the same time, the symbol that it is a very important institution, even without artworks, of course, not for life, but only for this time, even without artworks in vitrines. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is actually some images from the Dortmund. And yeah, so what we have done, we decided to open our yard, and we started the programs inside the yard, as we really didn't know if it's safe or not safe to let people go in the museum inside. We proposed people art books, we proposed coffee, we made cookies, we have several concerts in the yard. It's interesting that before the yard was not open publicly, and it happens only during the war. And suddenly people start to feel that the people actually like it very much and really sent us a lot of very warm messages. Just because they realize that in the war, when you have to take care about everything, about your family, about your relatives, about your job, about the soldiers, about the humanitarian aid, suddenly somebody cares about you. And this was actually what museum has done for the people who are living nearby and who are living in Kyiv. It was mid of the May when not a lot of people already came back. They only started came back in the city. And it was really like a gift for the city and for the people who love the museum to come in this year and to stay there. After that, next slide, please. We decided that that experience of empty walls and this tragedy of being alone in an empty space belongs not only to us, and we propose this experience also to our visitors. To be honest, I thought that my colleagues will do the excursion through the using the captions and reminding people what kind of what pictures was here and what pictures was there and what culture was here and so on. But my colleagues has done a beautiful thing. They decided not to talk about the missed artworks. They decided to talk about what is left, about the building, about the interiors, about the family, about the great influence of this institution on the city and great influence of this institution for the visitors and trying actually to refill the buildings, not with new senses, but just to remind that actually Varvara and Bogdan Khanenko also went in empty building once. And now we're again in this empty buildings, and we could refill it with the new senses, we fill it with new pictures or with the old pictures. But this is the moment when all your attention concentrated not only on golden frames or on very nice Madonnas, but it's concentrated about on the museum itself and and actually the founders, and also the mission of the museum in the wartime. Next slide, please. This is the part of the excursion, because after the excursion, we also, or during the excursion, we also saw people, old archive photos, and also telling them about the story of the exposition and what used to be in this room before. Next slide, please. And next project which we've done, we started in August, and we invited Ukrainian contemporary artist Oleg Kalashnik with the project Soldiers Invasion. This project has a very interesting story because it was opened 2 days before the war in Kharkiv, in Yermilov Center. And all the time, several months actually, the people using the shelter, the Yermilov Center as a shelter, and they're hiding them, and we're surrounded by these soldiers from this project. After that, we decided that this is very interesting and very interesting experience for our museum to talk about the historical event, and when actually the art started to be the museum artwork, and when the event is ready to be a part of the museum and history, and when actually the mummification takes place just after 2 or 3 months when the object was created. So we decided to present this exhibition in our rooms where used to be the Asian exposition. Next slide, please. You see that Oleg Kalashnik is working with the figures of the toy soldiers. Actually, we all have them in our childhood. There were only 2 types of soldiers, actually Soviet one and exotic one. And he playing with the figure of the soldiers and creating the new objects. We didn't remove any captions from our Asian exposition. Next slide, please. We left all captions on the same places. We only add the shadows of the object which used to be in the vitrines, and add the soldiers, which was produced by Oleg Kalashnik. The text for this project was written by Sergei Zhadan and Evgen Stasinevich, 2 very bright persons, and they made the dialogue because one of the texts was written in Kharkiv in March and another one was written in August in Kyiv. And we created the dialogue between actually 2 different projects, but with the same object, and how it was changed and how it was how it get new senses and new ideas. Actually, if you will be interested, I will send you later all the information about this project. Next slide, please. Here, for example, you see the room of the Chapin art, which used to be the room of Chapin art. And we even tried to follow the idea of room and aesthetic of the rooms and objects which used to be in this exposition before. Many people who know our exposition, actually, they found this, they realized this parallels, and they also were surprised how it's beautiful path to these vitrines. And this raised the question, of course, that maybe the soldiers were hidden all the time in our museum. We just didn't know about it, of course, metaphorically. Next slide, please. The next project we've done in September, and very quickly, it's a co-production with the Opera Aperta. I have to mention that museum used to work before with some contemporary artists, but really it was 1 or 2 experiments, and not, of course, instead of the whole exposition, for example, of Asian art. We used to have also concerts of classic music, but of course we didn't have the all brand new opera in all museums. Opera Aperta made in 1 month and 1.5 months the absolutely new opera, and the opera was the musicians and the singers. They were in all rooms of the museums. and visitors have to move in between these rooms and could work and be in the museum during 5 hours. And changing the roads and changing and combining by themselves actually the scenes for this opera and creating their own history. I hated this object, which is left side, you can see, because when composers Roman Grigoriev and Ilya Razumeyko put this piano with a rocket inside, I told that, you know, guys, it's too direct. We don't need such direct messages. We are working with art. It could be more metaphorical if you would like to say something like that. But they insist on it and told me that, Yulia, you know, it's a document. It's not just an art object, but please see on this installation like a document of this time. Because one of our friends, musician, actually, his building was burned out and the piano was burned out because of the rocket hitting the building. And I thought, well, okay, could be document, but of course didn't like it and don't like, especially after the event on 10th of October. Next slide, please. But you know that to work with the artists, you all the time have this tricky thing that you know that some of them are really to predict the future, and then you feel it actually. That's why it's not very. You feel yourself not very comfortable when you could read this prediction. This is part of the opera. It was also a very brand new experience for the opera because the visitor was not fixed in one position. The visitor could move around the musicians and around the rooms. So really building something new for yourself. A lot of people actually came, then stay for 1 hour, then left the museum, and then came back in 1 hour and stay for 3 hours and moving with musicians and with the singers and actors. Next slide, please. This is also part of the opera. Next slide, please. Yes, and now we come to the last event, 10th of October. 10th of October, the Kyiv was actually hit by several missiles, and one of them was falling down 20 meters from the museum. We found a historical document which states that in August 1941, another bomb actually was fell down almost exactly the same place, and the museum was also partly damaged, and even artworks were damaged, and it's a special report about it in our archive. This time it happened early morning, actually 8:30. We were very lucky because no one was injured. No people from no staff museum, non-security of the museum were not injured. Unfortunately, all facade windows were broken down and part of the glass roof and part of the glass ceiling also, as you can see, just fall down on the floor. Next slide, yes. The left image is actually the place, is a view from the windows of the museum, so you could see the distance from the explosion to the museum, and yes, right image is part of the glass ceiling. Next, please. This our team. They are not cleaning clothes. They are people who are working in the museum, who are researchers of the collection, who are keeping of the collections, and who just came and have an idea what to do. Actually, nobody was. It was not necessary to tell someone what to do. People just came and just do what they can do in this situation. And next slide. Actually, the last one. We go through it very quickly. I mean, we managed to cover all windows very quickly, and for the moment we managed the project to conserve the roof and the ceiling. It happened because, of course, the museum is an institution which used to work for many years with the audiences and which seems as important institution for the society. That's why, for example, first day, many people called us and came to us to help to protect the buildings. That's why actually in 1 week we managed to write the project and to apply for several grants. Actually, that's why international partners helped us and called us and already given a lot of help to protect the museum. This is how the institution actually changed in between the war. We don't know if this changes and this concept of the institution with the contemporary art or with the Ukrainian art, if it will be like that after the war. But we know that we have to use this potential and we have to use this moment to rethink about our institution and to make as much as possible to test ourselves and to try to find the new formats and to think what actually is our institution and what it's about. And this is what we are doing during the last several months. And this afterwards, I would like to add some more things that actually the institutions and culture and museums, they're creating the mindset of the culture and of the people. And Russians prove that it's possible to form such a mindset that leads to the fact that the state or head of the state, president forms a tyranny and society that is ready to open the annex. These outcomes of the work of our colleagues in the museums, I mean in Russia, who formed such a picture of the world when all nations ready to open annex. And this is the responsibility of the cultural elite who work actually in the museum. Of course, it's also our responsibility. I mean, not only our Ukrainian museum, but all the society, all world museums who did not stop them at a certain level. Because how it happened that country with such big culture went crazy, I think it's the subject of the separate studies, as well as the role actually did museum play in propaganda. But the fact that Ukraine resists like this today, and maybe it's not such a visible result, but this is also a result of the museum who are refusing to be a propaganda. And our museums, maybe not perfect, but worked with the identity. And as a result, we fight desperately because we seem to have figured out our identity and we found our voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuliia. I think you are doing extraordinary work here, and please keep your questions and feedback and all the comments until we finish all the presentations. I'm sure you already have plenty to ask, Yuliia. We are moving to the second presentation, and I would like to introduce our second participant, Maria Blyzinsky, who is an independent curator, heritage consultant, and a writer. Maria is based in the UK, and she's an independent, as I said, curator specializing in exhibitions and interpretations. She was curator of astronomy and later the head of exhibitions at the Royal Museums Greenwich, where she now holds the position of curator emeritus. In 2007, Maria co-founded the exhibitions team, an association of independent museum professionals with a passion for exhibitions, collections, and interpretations. She's a published author and is currently writing a book about generating ideas for exhibitions due to be published in 2023, so next year. Maria has long-standing interest in the use of heritage and culture as a weapon during times of war. She was an advisor to Heritage Without Borders, a now defunct charity that trained museum professionals to work with colleagues in post-conflict countries. And she's currently providing pro bono assistance to ICOM UK, the UK branch of the International Committee of Museums, helping to coordinate initiatives that support museums in Ukraine. And Maria's talk is titled Protecting Ukrainian Heritage, a UK Response. Maria, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Tetyana, and thank you for inviting me today. Thank you to all of the speakers as well. The talk from Yuliia, thank you. That's amazing and very humbling as well. So it's all very well me talking about the UK response, but I think in comparison to what's happening in the museums in Ukraine, you are an inspiration to us all. So thank you. And the talks yesterday were fabulous too. I think, will my slides come up? Thank you. So as Tetyana said, I'm an independent curator and heritage professional. I've been independent for the past probably 14 years. I haven't actually counted. And before that, I was head of exhibitions at the National Maritime Museum, the Royal Museums in Greenwich. And that's my whole career has been working in museums. But one thing that I should also mention as well, where my name comes from, my father was Ukrainian. So he came over to England after the Second World War. My mother was English. Obviously, I have I grew up in the UK, so my education is a British education. But thanks to my father, I never forgot my Ukrainian heritage. And so with the full-blown invasion of Ukraine that started this year, I just knew that I had to do something. I wanted to think a lot about what I could do with my own skills as a heritage professional. Next slide, please. So, and not just me, it was the response across the whole heritage sector in the UK was amazing. Lots of people came together, they wanted to do something, they wanted to help, but for the longest time it was difficult to actually know what to do to help. As I'm sure you know, it was a chaotic situation, it was difficult to find out. But thanks to ICOM and other organisations, many museums, not just in the UK, but across the world, came together and were able to donate equipment of packing cases, storage equipment, digital equipment to ship over to Ukraine to help take things off display and to protect items as they were going into temporary storage, what we hope is temporary storage. What we've got here is the shipment that came from the UK. It was organised as a collaboration between ICON, which is the Institute of Conservators, ICOM, which sounds very similar, which is the International Committee of Museums, the UK branch, along with many UK-based museums and galleries, the British Museum, the Bodleian National Gallery, also the University of the West of England, and so on. Many people came together to compile the equipment and donate it. Constantine was the shipper, and the Aleph Foundation funded the actual transportation. The shipment was received in Lviv in August, and from there distributed to museums, the museums that most needed it. There was one package that was for the Kyiv Varvara, which came from the University of the West of England, because the university has a specialist department which deals with architecture which is damaged during war, and so they donated quite a lot of digital equipment to the Varvara to record the buildings as they are now, so that we can check what kind of damage, if damage does occur, and what kind of damage it is. And at the moment, they're doing online training for the staff there to use the equipment too. The list is still being updated. There's enough interest in the UK for a second shipment, but one of the problems was that because of one of the problems that came out of Brexit, the fact that UK has left the European Union, is that there were issues with actually transporting the equipment over borders. So even though it was designated as a humanitarian aid shipment, one of the issues was that because it needed to be offloaded in Poland, at that stage, we could only find drivers who would go as far as Poland, and then it had to be offloaded and collected by drivers from Lviv who came over to collect it. And it was that offloading and unloading which created a problem for the border control for customs. So Aleph stepped in and they were able to negotiate it. But essentially, although we in the UK know that there's enough interest and enough support to provide at least one more, if not more, donations, at the moment we're trying to find a humanitarian route that will take the equipment the whole way without being offloaded. So if anybody here has any suggestions, please do drop me a line. We'd be very interested to look into that. The next slide, please. Thank you. So apart from donations, what else can museums and cultural heritage professionals do to support Ukraine? Here we've got a display that was held at the British Museum, Culture in Crisis. The director of the British Museum said, culture is precious yet fragile. Whether tangible or intangible, it fosters understanding and belonging. The scale of human displacement and destruction in Ukraine is deeply distressing, as are the threats to its rich culture. Other museums as well did temporary displays. And the important thing there is it helps to raise awareness. Some museums held events for refugees who are coming over here, but also there has been some support for heritage professionals who have fled to the UK to help with their professional development. Personally, I think that more could be done, but that's I think that's just one of the things that we need to be aware of. The important thing is that it's raising awareness and helping to spread the word. The next slide, please. So this is a not very good photograph, but essentially it's as soon as one of the things that I did was that I approached all of my contacts in various museums to remind them of my Ukrainian heritage and to spread the word that I'd be keen to assist with any projects and to help them with anything that was to do with Ukraine, and to donate the fee to Ukrainian charities to support the war. So London Transport Museum, who is one of my previous clients, I spoke to the head of programming and head of public outreach there. He reminded me that several years ago we were doing a project that looked at disused underground stations in London, and in one of those stations, it had actually been built during the Second World War as a shelter, and had never been converted into, with the idea that it would become a station after the war in Clapham, but it had never actually, after the war, it was never actually converted into a station. So essentially, it's almost like a ghost station. But after the war, it was used as accommodation for people who were waiting to have their homes rebuilt, and then for people who were coming to visit the UK. So people who were coming to visit the Great Exhibition at the South Bank Centre or the Windrush generations, some of those people stayed in the shelter as well. And we were walking around, and Chris pointed out that there was lots of graffiti on the walls, all of which he'd photographed, and much of which he'd transcribed or been able to translate. And there was one piece that he showed me, and he said, I can't figure this out. He said, I've looked online. I think it might be East European. I think it could be Bulgarian. What do you think? And as you can see, the little symbol in the middle, it's the trizub. And I showed him the back of my phone that has a sticker of the trizub symbol on it. And I said, I know exactly what language that will be. That's Ukrainian. And so thanks to him, he requested me to write a blog post about the graffiti to get it translated. And so the piece that you can see here is dated the 27th of March, 1949. And it translates, I used my Ukrainian is not very good, so I did use I used a relative to help translate it. And it says, here lived the wandering Ukrainians heading to Canada. Whoever reads this, remember us. There's another piece as well. There was another piece of graffiti not far away either that says, Advyuk slept here, 1st of July, 1951. So these were the first Ukrainians after the Second World War to come over to the UK. Displaced from the camps in, many of them were coming from the camps in Italy, in Rimini. And some of them obviously were on their way, destined to go to Canada, but some stayed here as well. One of those people includes my father. You can just imagine the people who were lying in their bunks in this underground cavern, underground tunnel, writing these, scribbling these messages on the wall. And that I think that the thing here was that they were seeking safety in a world that was still piecing itself back together after years of conflict. And also that it was an underground station. And today we see many Ukrainians sheltering on underground stations as well. So history here is definitely repeating itself. Now, next slide, please. So beyond that, what else? I was racking my brains to think what else could museums do to help, and I approached ICOM UK, so ICOM, the International Council of Museums, the UK branch, to see whether they would be interested in developing a series of online talks, heritage talks, just something simple. We wanted it to be sort of bite-sized information, relatively informal, but to encourage people to really think about what's happening in Ukraine, but also what they can do in their day-to-day practice that could, that the changes that they could make to their own practice that could help raise awareness of Ukraine and make sure that Ukrainian history is conveyed correctly and properly as well. So they have literally, the talks have literally just been announced this week. Here's the announcement that is on the ICOM website. Thanks to the Ukrainian Institute in Kyiv and the Ukrainian Institute in London, who we're doing it in partnership with, as well as ICOM Ukraine, their branch as well. And there will be 3 talks. Next slide, please. So the first talk will be on ICOM red lists. There's an ICOM red list that is currently being compiled for Ukraine. So we have people from ICOM headquarters to talk about red lists in general, as many people don't actually know how they operate and how they can be used, but also a representative from ICOM Ukraine to talk about how the Ukrainian red list is being compiled and thoughts for how UK practitioners can use the list as well. We're having a talk on decolonizing Ukrainian heritage. So things, we have a speaker from the University of Cambridge Library, and she has been writing a fantastic blog post about how she's a Slavonic expert, and she's been writing a fantastic blog post about how she's going through old catalogue entries on the database entries about the books and archives in Cambridge University Library and making sure that the language is appropriate, so spelt correctly, and the descriptions regarding imperialism, Russian imperialism, are correct as well. And then the third talk will be about identifying and collecting Ukrainian culture, how to recognize it if it's in your collection, if you've got objects that you're not sure about, how to identify those, and how to promote those too. Next slide, please. So those are the talks that we're putting forward with ICOM. We're also trying to think really, really creatively about what other changes could we do, what other ideas are there. One idea would be guidelines for non-specialists. This image here is from a children's ABC book, which I bought a while ago off of eBay. It's from the 1950s. What I love is that because I'm learning Ukrainian, it's nice and easy way to learn Ukrainian. But the reason that I chose this picture is because there are certain letters of the alphabet that don't occur in the Russian alphabet. So the letter here, Y, I think I pronounced that correctly, is an important letter for non-specialists, that perhaps if you've got some text in front of you and you're wondering, is this Ukrainian, is this Russian, is this from somewhere else from the former Soviet Union, that could be a way of thinking, actually, this could be a Ukrainian piece of text. It's simple guidelines like that I think non-specialists in the UK would find really, really helpful to put into their daily practice. Other things that we could think about would be collecting, contemporary collecting as well. There was, after the Second World War, there were huge diasporas of Ukrainians who settled in cities like Manchester, Nottingham, Derby, Bedford, Edinburgh, Cardiff. I've got this idea that I want to connect with museums in these cities to find out, do they have anything in their collections that represent the diasporas that came over? My sense is that they may do, or they may have things that they don't recognize. But I also feel that there are people of my generation whose parents are no longer with us, and we probably have items that belonged to them and we're wondering what to do with them. Personally, I've got things, but because I'm a museum person, I wouldn't let go of them. But there may be other people out there who don't know what to do with those letters, don't know what to do with those books or photos. So I think this is a chance to really start to think about, this could be a time to collect items that are to do with diasporas and communities, Ukrainian communities that settled in various towns and cities around the UK. Next slide, please. Have I frozen? Oh, thank you. Thank you. And then finally, or almost finally, one of the talks yesterday, a fabulous talk, was looking at interpretation that is often seen about Ukraine and how it's often mixed up with Russia, Soviet Union, and so on. I wanted to actually show a label that I was very impressed with, that was at the British Library. This was several years ago. They had an exhibition about Russian propaganda. I'm very sorry, it's a very bad photograph, but photography wasn't allowed in the exhibition. So I was taking a photograph surreptitiously, hoping that nobody would notice. But I've done a transcript at the side, and I thought that this was quite a sensitive way of describing the situation. So I'll just read it out. So the objects were some postage stamps, and the caption says, "These Russian imperial stamps were overprinted with the symbol of independent Ukraine, Prince Vladimir's trident. Ukraine claimed autonomy in summer 1917 and declared independence in January 1918. For a short period, it merged with the Western Ukrainian People's Republic that had emerged on the territories of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, it was soon divided again between Poland and Soviet Russia, according to the treaty that concluded the Soviet-Polish War. As the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, it became part of the Soviet Union." Oh, I can see. I'm not sure if I've made that spelling mistake, Tetyana, or if that's in the label. I should check. No, that's actually in the label. So you're right. Prince Vladimir hasn't been transcribed correctly. But for me, I think that actual part of history to be reduced into a label of about 50 words, that's actually not a bad way of doing it. That was several years ago, but hopefully now that Ukraine is so much more in people's consciousness, in museum people's consciousness, I think we should be able to see more labels that are correctly written and related and engaging. So final slide for me. Of course, there are so many ways of thinking about cultural heritage in Ukraine. This is a piece of my favorite graffiti that I spotted there when I was traveling around in 2019 in Kolonia. And I think photography and digital collections are going to be very, very important as ways of recording what items have been lost, what culture has been lost. And that's not just the items that are currently in museums, but things that are around us that maybe we take for granted, things like graffiti and so on. If anything good, if we can think about anything positive that has come out of the terrible situation, I think there are some fantastic stories that we're hearing amongst the speakers today and yesterday and elsewhere. For me, it's about as well, there's this chance, this opportunity of forging these new networks that didn't necessarily exist before, networks between museums and cultural heritage professionals in Ukraine and over here in the UK as well. So many talented and inspirational people. I hope that those networks go forward. I'm sure they will. And I think that will become stronger as well. So thank you. I think my talk has been although I said that I was going to talk about protecting Ukrainian heritage as a UK response, I think it was probably much more a personal response.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. Well, personal response is super important and would be nothing, if we wouldn't have a personal response to the situation. Again, just note your questions to Maria. We'll come back to them in a while after we complete all the presentations. And just a small, maybe technical announcement. We don't have any scheduled breaks or pauses, so please take your break during the event as we go whenever you need them. And I would like to move to our next presenter and introduce Alexandra Kovalchuk. Alexandra is an acting director of the Odessa Fine Arts Museum. She is member of the Odessa City Council and she leads the NGO Museum for Change. She will speak mainly about the museum, so I will just briefly introduce the NGO where she works, because Museum for Change was founded in 2016 to facilitate fundraising and emancipate museums in Odessa. After February 24th, NGO helps Ukrainian museum professionals that have language or skills barriers to receive support from international organizations. And they have already helped more than 50 cultural institutions to receive emergency aid for more than 800,000 euro, and they continue their work. So Alexandra's presentation is titled Odessa Fine Arts Museum, from the imperial tool to the most pro-Ukrainian space of the city. And I, as the part of the Ukrainian community, have to say that we have been fascinated with the change and transformation of the Odessa Museum. First of all, thanks to the director, Alexander Roitburt, an artist and an art manager who unfortunately passed away a year ago, but he made a tremendous work, and Alexandra is continuing it. Alexandra, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Tetyana. I'm going to speak about Alexander in my presentation and about the achievements, oh, I apologize, about the achievements of the museum. No. So Odessa Fine Arts Museum, I will go a little bit about history, and I will speak about directors who played the main role and how we look at it from the ongoing war and full-scale invasion of Russian Federation to Ukraine. The museum was founded 123 years ago in Odessa, that was part of Russian Empire at that time. But the initiative was run by local non-governmental organization. It was called Society of Fine Arts, of art lovers and patrons of the art and artists who lived in Odessa and wanted to develop community culture. This is the photo from the museum exposition from the beginning of 20th century. And you can see that there is a Venera Milovskaya, the replica from it's a Greek art, and its collection was came from different places of the world, and it was international at that time. The main sources of the collection was the collection of this society, and it was formed during 30 years before the museum was open. And then, of course, a big part of the collection was received from the Imperial Academy of Arts, and that would be mainly artists who we now recognize as Russian and not even as a contested artists. One of the first important directors of the museum was a very well-known at that time artist who was before that the director of Odessa Art School. It was a Kyriaka Standi. He became a director after the 2 years dispute between the Society of Fine Arts and the City Hall about who will be the next director of the museum. And as we will see further, this dispute between local authorities and the communities who support and who are interested in the museum development would continue returning to the museum's life. And he became a director in 1917 when the revolution outburst. And actually his last years of his life, the powers in Odessa changed like 4 times. It was either Red Army with communists or White Army of the empire, of the Russian Empire, or it was also of the allies of Russian Empire. So whenever power changed in Odessa, he would find himself either on the committee that in the case of Red Army would be accepting to the museum works of art that were stolen from the houses of noblemen or of entrepreneurs who left Odessa, who fled Odessa. Or then when White Army returns, he would be on the committee that helps to give back the stolen works of art. But eventually the last word was communists. They established the Soviet power, Soviet state in Odessa. And after that, the museum collection received a lot of objects that from our perspective now is the subject of restitution. The collection, as I said, was international. This is the photo of Oriental or Asian room. And this is another photo from the main exposition of the museum, where again, we see these antique statues, replicas. In 2023, about that, the Soviet state decided that the collection of this museum has to be divided, and it is a little bit, it kind of goes in parallel with things that were happening to the Khanenko Museum in Kyiv, because this is the strategy and the logics of the totalitarian Soviet state. So the museum collection was divided in 2 parts. First part would go to the Museum of Western and Eastern Art, which is something that we consider alien during 70 years of Soviet Union. And then what was called at that time a motherland art stayed in the Museum of Fine Arts. But exposition would change all the time. We have hundreds of pictures from 20s and 30s where we could trace how certain works travel through the museum floors and rooms. And of course, it was very much focused on the narrative that was against capitalism, that was against entrepreneurship, that was pro peasants and workers, and etc., etc. But some things, even though there was this narrative that was about mainly peasants and workers, there was a huge place in this museum that was taken actually by Pushkin. Not only there were special exhibitions devoted to Pushkin. Some rooms in the museum exposition was called Art of Times of Pushkin, like giving the frame to the period of time, which is now very interesting for us to reflect on. Another part of the exposition of the museum consisted of avant-garde collection, which was brought to the museum by the very really true communist, the director of the museum, Emsky-Mogilevsky. And he went to Moscow and received a lot of works from Russian avant-garde at that time. He brought it to Odessa, and it was in the museum. You can see here big work by Kandinsky, by Goncharova, Lentulov, some that we cannot identify for sure, but this collection ceased to exist. We don't know where it is. It disappeared shortly after Emsky-Mogilevsky was arrested by KGB. Most likely, what we know, we think that it was burned in the museum yard. Because Emsky-Mogilevsky was arrested in 1937 when the Soviet purges were happening and all over Soviet Union and especially in Ukraine. And of course, people of culture were an important part of the victims of the regime, even though they were true believers of communism, like Emsky-Mogilevsky. He was accused to be a spy and he was executed in 10 days after he was arrested. And going back to the exposition, no matter how it changed a lot, there was always something that stayed, and it would be the symbols of empire, of Russian Empire, and of course the Catherine II, the main dominance of this room. And it traveled through the same room for a couple of times, but it always stayed in the museum. And interesting thing that even today, after February 24, when most of the works of art from the museum walls were sent to safer places, Catherine II stays in the room because it was too heavy, too big, and too complicated for us to move it somewhere. Then after Emsky-Mogilevsky death, of course, there was World War II, and at that time, part of the collection was stolen with the retreating armies of Germany and Romania. Some works we still don't know their path and where they are. Some works were lost during the evacuation. And the museum directors later were very afraid to do something because, of course, there were more museum directors were executed after the end of the World War II. Interesting thing that on June 11th, 1954, the exhibition opened in the museum that was devoted to the 300 years anniversary of Ukraine and Russia reunion. And it is particularly interesting right now as an example of how the museum was the tool of propaganda, not only speaking about certain narrative about the Russian Empire, about Soviet Union, where culturally it always was for sure the continuing of the empire. And here we see how exhibitions could feed this narrative of Russia and Ukraine being same people, reuniting after some kind of being disconnected, which is not true. And Vladimir Putin and his cultural managers and the museum directors from Russian Federation and the narrative that we hear from Russian Federation today continues this path, this narrative of Ukraine and Russia being reunited. So the next important director of the museum came to the position 1972. It was Ivan Semenyuk. He did a great change to the museum. He increased the territory of the museum. He managed to get apartments for people who lived in different rooms of the museum after World War II. And finally, all rooms of the museum could be used for storage or exhibition or for workers to work in, actually. He doubled the collection and he changed the number of workers in the museum. New scholars came, new researchers, guides, and scientists. And after all of these achievements, he managed to do with the international activities, also sending some works from the Odessa Fine Arts Museum to other countries and receiving international exhibitions for the first time in a long time. And he was arrested by KGB after the denunciation, a report sent to them claiming that he purchased some furniture in a not a legal way. And to give a bit of context on that, at that time, any person who wanted to buy furniture in Soviet Union had to wait in lines sometimes for years. So maybe he used some of his connections to buy that furniture. And still, that cost him his life because he was accused, he was prosecuted, he went to jail for 3 years, and he hanged himself shortly after he was released. And after that, for the next 40 years, the museum was slowly degrading, going from an institution that was developing to the institution that had a lot of buckets in use every time it rained. And this is how the room where actually early works by Kandinsky were stored, and Serebrikova and other artists, with the very important and expansive collection, and that's what would happen there. It was in 2018 when we started the move to bring new director to the museum, and it was Alexander Roydburg, mentioned by Tetyana. He's here in the blue short, and the new team that joined the museum after he was appointed as a director of the museum. And Alexander started on the next day he came to the museum. He started working on re-expositions. And when I say re-exposition, it's absolutely different thing that is something that our international colleagues are used to. It wasn't a research, it wasn't debates, long discussions, and some experts who would join the team. No, it was mostly his own decision after prompt maybe telephone calls with some experts he needed. And he was just changing it very fast, every day, replacing some works of art with a different, that finally given the voice and space for works that were stored for 70 years and longer in the museum storage. And he did a lot of things, including this famous performance that I actually was against of, because it was too much for me, but it was very important. And I understand it now as a very important gesture to broaden the limits and the stereotypes of what the museum is, to break and destroy the Russian stereotype of the museum to be the place where you go to look at things, to the notion that museum is the place where you go to think of things, and our objects have to give you a space and opportunity to think, actually. And this performance was a very important statement at the time. all of this activity that he provided, it started to be very noticeable in Odessa and beyond Odessa and all over Ukraine. And pro-Russian deputies, politicians who were part of the party that was actually founded by Russia. Now investigation is still ongoing, but we know for sure that they received funding directly from Kremlin. And the ideas they were standing on was traditional values, Russian language, Russia and Ukraine being the same people. They were speaking about it, they were building their political career on these messages. And they've started the war on the museum and the director. And for 2 years, they were trying to fire Alexander Roitburt and to get rid of the new team and new changes and new understanding of the museum that he brought. Eventually, there were 2 big rallies with more than 3,000 people participating in each of them. And it was the moment when we could actually see the result of our work with audience, with the communities, and realizing that we are changing the lives of communities, and these communities are ready to go and stand for the museum and for the museum directors. That was an amazing achievement, and it was all very organized. Of course, we won. And this was a great moment in the museum's history when the director wasn't suppressed, wasn't repressed, and the community managed to save the director and to keep it in the position. So for the next year, we had a beautiful time of developing all kinds of communities around the museum, fundraising events, cinema nights. We had a beautiful new team of young and talented people. We had a lot of programming for kids, and of course, lines on the free entrance day were a thing that would always be in the museum. We continued renovation and re-exposition. As Alexander was saying, sometimes he would come to work in the morning and say, so today we're decolonizing this room and then we're decolonizing the next room. There was a lot of humor in his approach. And again, this was a very personal thing for him. And it was a great example and the message to the museum communities of Ukraine and also to general public. The main thing, the most important thing that Alexander managed to do 2 months before he passed away last summer, it was opening of the new exhibition of Ukrainian art, starting from speaking about 100 years of Ukrainian history, of the history of art connected with Odessa. And it was the first, so we became the first museum in Ukraine where you could see the artwork starting from 16th century to present day. And it was very important. Alexander was the first one in the Ukrainian museums who was very free and keen to speak about socialistic realism, even including portrait of Stalin to the galleries with explanation of why we're doing this, why we need to speak about him in the art museum and among artworks. There was a whole devoted to the second avant-garde, the times after Stalin died and the times of stagnation. And of course, Ukrainian nonconformists and art of independence, following by the most contemporary Ukrainian art. It wasn't the perfect result, it was first result, and it was the first very important statement, an opportunity for Ukrainians to look at our art history of the 20th century with all of it painful moments and tragic moments and moments of resilience of Ukrainian people. We had a beautiful team, and the museum itself became very, very pro-Ukrainian place. And if someone was asked, what is the most pro-Ukrainian place in Ukraine, they would immediately say that it's the Odessa Fine Arts Museum. This pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russia existed actually only before February 24th. Because then we became just Ukrainian people who are fighting for their country. And I'm very happy that we can pass to the past these storms. But returning to the February 20th, for example, what it meant to be a pro-Ukrainian place. Was it flags in our yard? No, I don't think so. Was it the art in the collection? No, because it's actually pretty much Russian. We have a lot of Russian art in the collection. We have a lot of art of Russian Empire, and we have a lot of imperial art showing the emperors and their court. And still, the museum was a very pro-Ukrainian place. When I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about the message that we were sending through our programs, through our exhibitions, through every step we do in the museum. Because it was always about tolerance. It was always about different communities. It was always human-centric, putting human in the center of each discussion, of each action. It was very keen on human rights, on cooperation and responsibility. Responsibility for our past and in front of our future. It was about the history of Ukraine, and it was about freedom. And that's actually what pro-Ukrainian means for me, and I really wish that is how the world would see Ukraine, and to know what we're fighting for and why we're protecting our cultural heritage. So finishing this presentation with a slide from the February 24th, when we had beautiful work by Maria Kulikovskaya in the center of the room, where about 100 years ago, Venera Milovskaya, replica of Venera Milovskaya, was standing. And we have a lot of packing materials that were purchased before February 24th. We're packing up the exposition to send it to safety. And the final thing that I'm thinking about, I keep thinking about, is that this museum pointed out that the ideas are much more important than the object of art that we're storing, and that we are very much responsible about the narrative that we share, and about giving the space and the time for people to think, to reflect, and to make their own conclusions in order to protect our heritage and to protect our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandra. Admire all the work you do, and really Ms. Roy put it in all possible senses. Personal, professional. I really feel like we lost. That was a great loss. We still didn't recover from. Now we are approaching our fourth and final presentation for today. And I would like to introduce the next speaker. Tetyana Goskar is a director and curator of the Curatorial Research Center, founded in 2018 to modernize curatorial practice and support the profession's technical and ethical skills. She is Art Fund Hadley Fellow at the Museum of Cornish Life, postdoctoral research fellow at the Decolonizing Arts Institute at the University of Arts London, and fellow of the Museum Association, former member of its Ethics Committee, accredited facilitator and honorary fellow at Swansea University. Previously, she was Arts Council England changemaker. Tetyana is a practitioner researcher, having curated 30+ exhibitions and collections research projects, lectured international on collections, material culture and heritage, and trained and mentored around 100 diverse people in curatorial practice. And Tetyana's title, presentation title, is "The Time of Stalins and Hitlers is Not Over: Museums Perceiving Decolonization After Occupation." Tetyana, please, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And I just wanted to say how both humbled and inspired I feel being in all of your company. And I hope people tuning in also feel the same way. So I wanted to start by outlining to you what I understand to be the dynamics of colonial and decolonial approaches, the colonial and the decolonial mindset. And while I've been challenging dominant modes of thinking and doing in public museum curation for a long time, it has been over the last 3 years in particular that ideas around decolonisation have truly entered the museum sector in the UK and gathered some kind of momentum. So, for example, we'll come to that slide in a minute, if that's okay. So I don't need any slides at the moment. So, for example, the Museums Association of the UK published decolonisation guidance for the UK museum sector in 2021, about a year ago. And this was the culmination of 2 years of quite grueling and soul-searching working group discussions and contributions from across the UK museum landscape, of which I was one part. The pressure to examine colonial era legacies in a former colonizing country's museums has come, in our case, from outside of the sector. This dynamic is important to remember. It's not possible for a former colonizing country's museums to attempt their version of decolonization without positioning themselves in this framework first. And you have to get your history right too. Decolonizing your practice means to both understand where your power and privilege comes from and to take actions to divest some of that power and privilege to those who have been excluded, marginalized, objectified, or misrepresented. And this is as near to a framework definition as I dare go. Indeed, we want complexity, we want fuzziness, and we want to embrace contradiction, as museums perceiving decolonization after occupation must do so in an inclusive way. The mess of colonial legacies is very much a human problem. Perhaps this is more eloquently described by Arundhati Roy, author of The God of Small Things and The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, as well as several influential works that question colonialism. Her understanding of colonialism, which is also the intellectual foundation of the Decolonizing Arts Institute at the University of Arts London, says, and I quote, "Whose colonization of whom are we talking about? Some countries have colonized other countries. Some cultures have colonized other cultures. Some races and castes have colonized and enslaved others. Some languages have colonized other languages. Some religions have eviscerated others. Some ideologies have wiped out others. Some genders have dominated and oppressed others. The categories are infinite, the hierarchies complicated and intersecting, and the project of domination is ongoing." The project of domination is ongoing is what resonates for me in this exploration of what colonialism really means in its widest sense. The empathetic version of this paradigm requires us to think about a time or times we have felt rejected or excluded from something or a group, or felt anxious about stepping into a new space. Actively reflecting on those deeply personal moments of discomfort and pain, feeling like you are the only one who looks, feels, sounds, thinks like you, is a critical piece of work everyone undertaking decolonizing work needs to do and keep doing. Your positionality is also important. It is an external assessment of your power and privilege in relation to others. This is not binary, but amorphous, shapeless, and your position may change, on the one hand, as the one with the power, and on the other hand, the one without the power and privilege. So in the midst of and in the immediate aftermath of invasion, occupation, genocide, cultural destruction, and erasure, the focus of museums and heritage will be on rescuing, replacing, and healing. As we've already heard from so many of the talks earlier and yesterday, this is ongoing, the rescuing and the healing that will come afterwards. Any web search on museums in Ukraine and in the many other regions of the world mired by the project of domination results in story after story of the physical destruction and denuding of cultural buildings and artifacts, and the recording of that destruction until such a time as integrity can be restored or recreated. So, for example, we heard about the ICOM Red List work from Maria earlier. But what happens afterwards, after the rebuilding, the building and branding anew, what happens then? The desire for true decoloniality will take time following occupation and conflict. There is no decolonial endpoint. It is not, in that sense, a project. It requires museums to be places of long-term recognition of hurt and the healing of rifts, welcoming one and all. So when it comes to occupation and conflict, nationalism can be a means for resistance and survival, but internationalism and transnationalism have to be the means for sustaining humanity's collective safety. However, I wanted to insert a caution, particularly as we've just heard with the example from Odessa, that, you know, beware of museums that parade colonialism as internationalism when it is nothing of the sort. Whatever happens in our museums in the future, when it comes to the project of domination, our history will always be part of their history, and their history will always be part of our history, and you've got to get your history right. This is where perhaps uniquely in society, we might possibly perceive the museum as having the most potential to position nation and heritage in a decolonial mindset. So let me now share with you two case studies which made large impressions on me as a curator operating in the context of a former, maybe still colonizing country. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. It is dangerous to think that the time of Stalin's and Hitler's has passed. This is a quote from the former president of the Republic of Estonia, Lennart Meri, from 1999. And it inspired the title of this talk and comes from an information sign of the exhibition of Soviet monuments of the Estonian History Museum in Tallinn. Photographed while visiting in 2019, I was struck at the contrast between the stories inside the museum, ones of how Estonians resisted Soviet imperialism and finally overthrew it with the Singing Revolution, and the ones outside on the grounds. The severed Lenin heads and Stalin body parts were in themselves monumental and striking, but they were no longer on tall plinths that glorify and dominate, but on the ground, in the grass, at the same level of the visitor. They are imprints where the visitor is invited to reflect at their own level, whoever they are. I found the interpretation matter of fact. It wasn't excusing nor apologizing, and it wasn't judgmental, but it was powerful. It is dangerous to think that the time of Stalin's and Hitler's has passed. The message rings true and clear. The horror is just behind the horizon. One monument reinterpreted in the Soviet Monuments exhibition was a gigantic granite and bronze sculpture showing a small group of thrusting men with outsized fists punching out. It was dedicated to the armed coup of Estonian communists in 1924, and it was erected in July 1925 near the Baltic Station. The interpretation was simple, humorous, honest, and effective, and I quote from it. People joked in Soviet times that this was the only monument to an uprising that depicted all the participating revolutionaries at once. The group of sculptures was also mockingly called Trying to Catch the Train to Moscow as a jab at the revolutionaries who had ties to the Soviet Union. True enough, most of those who attempted the coup and managed to flee did find refuge there. The 1970s, from where this sculpture from the period in which the sculpture came from was a particularly brutal time for Estonian culture attempting to survive a tightened Soviet-Russian grip. But I experienced this museum, the Estonian History Museum, as one that was confident in dealing head-on with the nation's complicated past, where many were oppressed, tortured, and excluded simply for being who they were and who they wanted to be, but where also some were for the cause of Soviet colonialism. Estonia continues to deal with decolonizing its public realm. Only this summer, in August, Prime Minister Kallas said, and I quote, "As symbols of repressions and Soviet occupation, they have become a source of increasing social tensions. At these times, we must keep the risk to public order at a minimum." The removals of public Soviet monuments mainly focused on the eastern border town of Narva on the Russian border, where one particular monument became a touch point, a replica of a T-34 Soviet tank, which commemorates the Soviet soldiers who died freeing Estonia from Nazi Germany during World War II. And what is the resolution of this removal? The monument is to be displayed in the Estonian War Museum in Vimsi, north of the capital Tallinn. This is really very far away from the touch point in the border town, where 57,500 inhabitants are mainly Russian speakers. However, this and other removals across Estonia have also led to protests and riots. Some Russian-speaking Estonians claimed their history was being erased. Sensitive to the strength of feeling, not specifically to modern-day Russian Federation, but to the memory of those who fought for and defended Estonia during World War II, Interior Minister Lauri Läänemets said that they confirmed that the dismantling operation and transfer will be carried out in a dignified manner. For example, the flowers and the candles placed at the monuments will be taken to a cemetery, not thrown away. Kallas also said that the common grave of the victims of World War II in the border town will now get a neutral grave marker, and it will remain a dignified site for commemoration, a neutral grave marker. So what will actually happen at the Estonian War Museum with this monument? And with these stories of protest and counter-protest and the manner of its removal, this all remains to be seen. To what extent can museums be neutral places of memory and commemoration in a decolonial sense? I feel rather than neutral, which those of you who have worked in museums for any length of time will know cannot really happen, museums should embrace plurality and embrace the mess. Museums should take a longer decolonial view of painful pasts that remember, reflect, and reveal society and culture in all of their contradictions and diversities. In many ways, the new Estonian National Museum in Tartu, which opened very recently in 2016 and replaced the previous National Museum dating to 1909, has perhaps arrived further on in their decolonial journey. Situated not far from Narva, Tartu, its motto, the city of good thoughts, is home to many Estonians of Russian heritage and a diversity of people from around the world, thanks to the University of Tartu nearby. The original museum was in many ways a pseudo-colonial confection dominated by Estonia's larger neighbor, Finland. Together with the Finnish influence in how Estonian folk arts and cultures were interpreted, came the early 20th century dominant view of Baltic German art. Apparently, some local Estonians regarded this German art as culturally revolting. So while the older museum was perhaps an antagonistic cultural site and collection, the new 21st century post-colonial National Museum decided to do things differently. The new museum was designed by an international collaboration of architects and designers. Its site is the former Rady airfield, which became a secret Soviet airbase and a site of fear that dominated the city for many decades. During Soviet times, the collections were hidden all over the city, you know, in scenes similar to we've seen in photographs shared today. They were seen by hardly anyone and certainly not open to foreigners. When I first visited in 2017 and spoke with the curator Agnes Alias, one thing above all resonated. In the Estonian National Museum, there are no stories or exhibits about famous people or events, and it is true. The people who have been elevated in this beautiful museum have unknown names or no names. No one person or group is elevated above the other, both physically or intellectually. The museum is internationalist and multilingual, with sophisticated e-paper labels that can be read in many different languages, including Russian, yet it is unmistakably Estonian. Due to the approach of conveying all people in a similar manner, the Soviet period is highlighted by the specific challenges of many different people, including Russian Estonians in the museum. This apparently came to the horror of Estonian ethno-nationalists. As we move from the Baltic to the Pacific, let us not also forget that in August 2021, the director of the National Museum, Alar Karis, was elected by Estonia's parliament to be the president of Estonia. So this is a true example, perhaps, of life imitating art. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So moving from Estonia to Aotearoa, New Zealand, I was there also in 2017, and I spent some time at Tairāwhiti Museum in Gisborne. This is a small town on the eastern cape of the North Island. Both Gisborne and its museum felt familiar to me. A small museum run by a small staff, completely embedded in its community, including giving homeless people a space to sleep during bad weather. On the one hand was the very well-endowed European-style decorative arts gallery. On the other hand, a chance to explore Maori curatorial culture in the same place. During 2017, this was also a year of planning for the nation marking 250 years since British Captain Cook's arrival on Aotearoa's shores. A commemoration that divided public opinion and feeling across the country. The town's very colonial name, Gisborne, was already changed by the museum by changing its own name to Tairāwhiti, which was its indigenous name some years prior. While I was visiting, there was also a debate about changing the national flag from one with the British Union Jack ensign to one more reflective of Aotearoa, New Zealand's many diverse communities and in tribute to its pre-colonial Maori past. The vote result was extremely narrow, and it was for now, or then, to preserve the status quo. And interestingly, much of the debate about changing the flag happened in a museum in the City of Wellington's museum, Wellington being the capital of New Zealand. However, it was one particular moment where I felt the scales really fell from my eyes when thinking about colonialism and decoloniality in museums and why it's important. In front of a diorama of Captain Cook and the crew of HMS Endeavour arriving on the shores of the Eastern Cape, that you can see illustrated in this picture here, in the Moana Gallery, a woman was heard saying this to a child in a very impassioned voice. They came here in their boats and they shot our people. Gisborne wasn't discovered by him either. We were already here. And they sent us off to war thinking we wouldn't come back so they could steal our land. You've got to get your history right. Those words have rung in my ears for the last 5+ years. And I have to say that if I was suggesting a quick fix to some of the efforts to decolonize this particular museum, and particularly the stories of British colonialism in New Zealand, I would just stick this up next to this diorama. The British explorer Captain Cook, you can see here, dressed in blue in the middle. He's the largest figure. He is followed by his men, and they are the ones central to this scene. Class is also alluded to in the colonial naval hierarchy. Cook's officers are in the red jackets, and the deckhands, the jack-tars, dressed in whatever they had. As the British sailors drag their launch to shore, on the opposite bank, we are drawn to the Maori figures, thinly and gracelessly painted with no faces and no humanity. This diorama does not represent the whole story. Well-researched history and the ancestral memories of those who endured the systemic violence and marginalisation of British discovery and colonialism from before the 17th century to the mid-20th centuries still struggle to find space in museums and galleries today, both of former colonies and here in the UK. The heroising of certain kinds of people and their deeds continues to be the modus operandi for museums more interested in promoting their brand and influence than in truthfully representing history, science, and art. From their earliest days, museums have been creators of pseudo-history, and as we heard from Yuliia, also propaganda. The decolonial mindset expects this and responds by doing the work, trying to get the history in all of its messiness right. So I'd like to finish by returning to the premise of my talk. Can museums really perceive a decolonized state once occupation is over? And if so, what will that museum be truly inclusive? Sorry, will that museum be truly inclusive and a genuine space for narrowing gaps of understanding and experience between people? So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we might have now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tetyana. Yeah, wonderful and insightful comparison of these two cases brings truly a lot of thoughts and questions. Now we are done with the presentations of today's program, and we can now move to the questions and discussion. And you can just maybe raise your hand so I know who has to say next. And I think we already have the first questions from what I see in our chat. And I think that the question is to Yuliia Vaganova, and it's about the exhibition, the photograph exhibition. Could the Khanenko Museum exhibition in Dortmund be launched as a touring show?
Thank you for this question. Actually, yes, because it's already in some museums. The short version of the exhibition and a little bit in other format will be presented in Berlin Kunstakademie actually next month, and we have already a request from another museum in Switzerland also to present this exhibition and to show how it looks like empty walls of the museum and how actually it could be I don't know, as a symbol or as a platform for reorganizing and for rethinking about the museum during such a difficult time as a wartime. You could send your question or send your contact to organizers, and they will follow. They will send me, and we could stay in contact about this project.
Wonderful. Yeah, so please just send the request to anywhere you can access the organizers of this particular event, and we will bring you in touch with the museum.
May I add something? Sorry, Tanya.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I would like to add one thing. From one hand, we think that the raising interest to the Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian museums all over the world. And we feel a big solidarity with the other countries who try to help us and with the money, with the materials, with the I don't know, with the expertise and so on. But when and this exhibition it's one of the gesture, it's one of the actually action which could be done. But at the same time, I would like to ask you to think not only about the money and not only about the materials which really needed and which we need. Because when people ask me, what do we need? Of course, I'm thinking about the people who could help us to do everything, but of course, it's hardly possible for people from the West to come now in the city with under the bombs. Also materials, yes, it also helps a lot, but it will help more if international organizations and international museums will loudly talk about the terrorist things which Russia is doing now, and will not connect with Russia, and not only keep silent, but tell loudly about it. Because when this July, I guess, or June, interview of Petrovsky, director of the Hermitage appears, which was printed also in English in the art newspaper, it was no reaction of any director of international big museum. Everybody were worrying how it could happen, but there was no public reaction. It means that Russia thinks that it's okay the way how they're doing. Also, we raised the question to the ICOM, to the ethic committee about the termination, the participation of the Russia in the ICOM. And unfortunately, for the moment, we still don't have answer about it because it never was done before. I understand it. But when museum actually use the propaganda and when museum move the collection from our museums to the territory, it of course doesn't go in any rules with the ICOMs. But unfortunately, there is no strong reaction. If it will be no reaction on the things what Russia is doing, what the Russian museums are doing, unfortunately, we will be absolutely helpless. I mean, all the materials and all money will be helpless in this situation. The only thing what we could do is stop this aggression and stop the war. And while we will not talk about this loudly, the museum as well, unfortunately, we will have such a situation for many months or years. I hope no, but nevertheless. So the only thing how museum could help is to talk publicly and loud, and directors of the museum have to stand with a certain position and tell directly to the Russian museum who are doing propaganda exhibition, who are organizing the soldier mobilization point in the museum, for example, Dark Museum. In Moscow, they organized soldier mobilization point, who are doing the exhibition like a NATO prison, like not Nazism, but NATO prison. And all the things you can find easily in internet. There are links in international press and sometimes also too. But unfortunately, still no clear and no clear reaction from museum community and from the museum directors. So what we are asking to do is actually to be loud and to be publicly loud and do not support cooperation with the Russian museum. We are not talking about the cancel Russia culture. It's another topic right now, but it's about just talking about the ethic of museum community and ethic of the scientist community. Thank you.
And if I may just quickly add to what Yuliia just said, that actually Russia is also given a bad example of how art can be misused, how museums can be misused, how art can be weaponized, yeah, and put really on the service of propaganda. And many other countries can also consider using it this way, you know. So if we don't stop Russia, if we don't say that this cannot happen, then we might have more and more problems in the future, because Russia is definitely the most violent at the moment, but is not the only imperial power and is not the only aggressor and occupying power in the world. Yeah, Katarzyna, yeah, please just turn on your mic. Don't forget to turn on.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Yuliia, for saying loudly what is needed now in the museum community. And I fully agree with you. And with Tetyana, who actually told me earlier about various aspects of about the fact that the ICOM does not want to whatever sanction the Russian museum directors, and that they could be still members of ICOM, and that they were still able to take part in the ICOM proceedings. So I know it might sound as somehow impolite, but this is what I was trying to say yesterday when I feel that when I asked Magdalena about her guidance, about her book, about how to decolonize museums, and I kind of perhaps impolitely I said that it is a list. That all those lists, what to do, how to increase visibility and transparency, that it is like a sermon, that we are incredibly polite. There are those set of very measured, politically correct steps what we should do in general. But when we are faced with the situation which is caused by the horrors of the Russian invasion of the sovereign entity of Ukraine, we cannot stop there, and we have to talk loudly about that. We cannot be polite anymore, and this idea that so in a way this is. Tetyana, I actually no. To all of you, I want to say that I actually thought that all presentations were wonderful, but I have a serious question. So the same question that I asked, that I directed to Magdalena, who produced the book, co-authored the book on how to decolonize museums, I would forward it to Tetyana. How about your? I know that you are not the only author, but we haven't got other authors to ask them the same questions. Do you would be sympathetic to the idea that these guidelines, how to support the colonization of museums, that it should be somehow revised loudly in the light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that Russia is not mentioned as the colonizer in neither of those guides. So I think this is the highest time that this issue is actually publicly posted. It is publicly posed and discussed by us, the practitioners.
I completely agree with you, and what was very interesting, particularly contributing to guidance that, as I said, is in a former stroke still current colonizing country, is I pushed hard for the Soviet example at least to be included, and because of the fixation in this country of seeing colonialism just through the lens of the British Empire, that didn't happen. However, the point you raise about ICOM, I think, is much more pertinent. And even if you look back at the last 3 years of the big arguments and the debate about the very definition of a museum, which the international museum community could not agree.
Exactly.
And you had certain people with more influence somehow having more say over what was acceptable as a definition of a museum. I think we should be questioning very seriously our international networks. Yes, of course, they are useful in many ways to bring us all together, but the very ethos of only questioning things that have happened and not being questioning of things that are going on now is not ethical, in my view. Now, ICOM have a code of ethics that if you look at it, you will find clauses and principles that would support you. And I don't know why the ICOM committee are not following their own code by bringing this up. I guess you could say the same about the behavior of the United Nations and how that is dealing with responding to what is happening now with Russian aggression and, as we know, other imperialist or proto-imperialist powers in the world. So I can't offer any solutions yet, but you are not alone in having these thoughts, and maybe there's an opportunity to revisit this particular issue after this, and that's certainly something I would be very interested in, because of course we have this tendency of just focusing on what happened in the past, because that's what museums have tended to be in the business of. But of course, in the sort of late 20th, 21st century, museums are for the now. I mean, I was really struck, Yuliia, by the images of the galleries of Buddhist art from being full of Buddhist art. And it made me think, how on earth did these things get there in the first place? To the empty cases, to a response to the occupation and the war and the invasion. And it made me wonder, in terms of looking in the long term about decolonizing museums or museums existing in a decolonial state, which aspects of these are going to stay at that museum? And I hope that's a vaguely useful contribution, but it's a big question. It's a big question.
I just jumping in, I just wanted to say that we have to abandon, in a way, this political correctness that, as Yuliia has said, it is just time now to talk loudly about certain things, that we have to protest, and yesterday somebody said that the decolonization process will continue, that all museums will eventually decolonize, but there will be other colonizers, there will be other usurpers who, I mean, Ukraine and Russia is not the only countries which are in war with each other. So things like that are happening all over the world. So perhaps, and democracy, as we know, is in peril. And so, and that unfortunately, it happens all over the world. So I think that it is time to be critical and to talk loudly, as you say, and to stop being polite and to be more aggressive, simply. I feel.
Well, at least
yes.
You definitely have to protect yourself when you are, threatened by weapons and someone comes into your house and wants to kill you and rape you and just take everything that belongs to you. Just a short reflection of what just was said about ICOM and other international organizations that definitely collapsed, and we face this in all the spheres of our life. Yeah, so there is no security basically in the world, and the United Nations doesn't do the job. There is kind of this collapse of financial and economical system that is tied with Russian money and Russian cheap gas, and the world somehow is not able to cope with that. And also this comes to the museums and art sphere, and it's definitely time to reinvent those things or rethink those things, reconsider. You know, if United Nations is not capable of changing its statute or its constitution, then maybe you know, it's time to reinvent some other institution, just step out of United Nations for everyone. Let just Russia stay there if they really you know, are not able to make any steps in that direction. And also, you know, if there is no way to exclude Russia from ICOM, maybe the others will just step out of ICOM because ICOM doesn't follow its own ethics, as we just found out, because they don't follow their own code of ethics. Just one of the thoughts, you know, how we can actually do something about it if like nothing can be done in theory. Other thoughts?
I don't want to dominate the space. I'm pretty sure that other people have questions. So I will stop with my questions, and I will of course speak if you are just still thinking about your questions. So I have a question now to Alexandra, which I absolutely you know, loved your presentation very much. Fascinating photographs of the interior of the museum of the 1920s, of this opening of the 1954 exhibition, celebrating the 300th anniversary of the reunion of Russia and Ukraine, which was just this after the Cossacks rebellion, wasn't it? That's this well, Ukraine as the country of Cossacks. But in fact, I don't want to ask. I love those photographs, and I just wanted to say how much I admire them and how interesting they are, especially in the view of the fact that I actually have visited the museum. So those photographs did so much to my kind of recollection of this museum that it's very important. But my question is different, is about something else. I know that we want to, I mean, I know that your critique of the display of Russian imperial art and the critique of the portrait of Catherine the Great, which as far as I can say, it is a copy of a variant of Dmitry Levitsky. Am I right?
Yes, that is a variant of Dmitry Levitsky. He did more than 20 during his life, and he was actually Ukrainian who built his career to the highest of it during the Russian Empire. Yes.
Yes, that's right. So that already points this. I mean, the fact that he was Ukrainian, he was born into a family of priests, which were very kind of the best educated people in Ukraine in the 18th century, which I learned somewhere. Am I right? Or perhaps I'm wrong, but
I can say something about the religious people to be most educated. I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm not a religious person myself, but no, I just read in a history book that they belong to those kind of the most elite strata of the society, but perhaps I'm wrong. The most important thing is that he was definitely of Ukrainian origins, that then he studied at the Imperial Academy, and he, in a way, he is example of this, of the artist of Ukrainian origin who became Russian, as it were, because all his career was in the Imperial Russia. So what to do with this aspect? This is what somehow interests me, because this is about transnationalism, isn't it? That that he is of Ukrainian origin, but he adopts a kind of Russian identity because there is no yet in the 18th century, there is no kind of the Ukrainian identity is not yet well formed, because it is before Shevchenko and this 19th century wave of, maybe I'm trivializing things, but
I think that Ukrainian identity existed by that time already. Okay. It was just different from the Ukrainian identity after Shevchenko and Katarzyna, etc. But the idea, we do have a lot of debates, and we had a lot of debates about this portrait. And after 2014 and the annexion of Crimea and the beginning of this war, of course, there were people in Odessa who would prefer not to see Catherine II in the museum exposition. And it cost us an effort to continue showing this work, but changing the narrative about it from being very excited about the quality of work itself and its artistic aspects or historical or some symbolic meanings that it contains, to looking at it as an part of the instrument of propaganda of the times of Russian Empire and to speak about it. But we didn't do a nice job. And actually right now in Odessa, there is a huge debate about the monument to Catherine II that was taken down 100 years ago. And then they've put it on that place in 2008 for the money of Russian Federation. And now we have a huge debate about the future of this monument that, of course, majority of the community wants to get rid of it. And I hope to find it in the museum yard one day. But another interesting thing about Levitsky and this particular portrait is that this portrait was on the background in the footage, in the picture taken on the day 4 territories of Ukraine were annexed by Russian Federation a couple of weeks ago. You can see actually the photo with these 4 people, heads of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk administrations, who came to Kremlin for this ceremony of annexing the territories and making them part of Russia in their perspective. And this picture is taken, and behind them there is a reproduction of a version of Levitsky of this very work, one other that is stored in the, I believe, Russian Museum, State Russian Museum. And if you look at the Putin's many addressing to the nation, you would always see Catherine II bust, a little statue standing behind him. And all of this is very much linked together. And that is another point why culture cannot be separated. And this is a very unmature and childish look from the museum community of the world, speaking about Russian culture as something that doesn't come in the same package with Russian aggression, violence, imperialism, and fascism, actually. So it will be very hard for us to process all of these experiences that we had. And another thing that I've noticed is that today we're fighting in a very interesting way. And I believe it never happened before, because we're fighting in present, we're fighting in past with the Soviet Union and its legacy and its roots, and the KGB that still exists and fights with us. And we're fighting at the same time with the Russian Empire by claiming our artists who were claimed by Russia, etc., etc. So it's a very multi-layer war that we're taken at this moment. And we can definitely see that Catherine II is standing behind Putin, and it all is part of the one story, and all comes in the same package. And it will be very hard for us to process all of these periods, all of these wars that we're going through, not only through the minds of scholars and scientists and philosophers in Ukraine, but also to reflect, to go through this as a people, as a nation. But that's the work we have to do, and to find a place for Catherine II and the portrait of Levitsky and the Levitsky himself and all other artists and people who collaborated with the Russian Empire or with the Soviet Union or with the Nazis.
But was he a collaborator? Do you consider him a collaborator? Dmitry Levitsky?
I'm not calling him collaborator. I'm saying, no, for him, I think that personally, I think that he had no choice. He lived in the structure where there was pretty much one path for him to become an artist. And he was a successful artist. He did what he did.
Thank you for this driving energy. We have actually three people who want to continue the discussion, and we have one question from our online audience, but I will let those who are here first, and then we'll read the question to a few of our presenters. So Miroslava, please.
Yes, thank you for letting me talk to all of you. And I want to thank Alexandra for her talk on Odessa, and Kasia for bringing up this issue of Levitsky. Well, Alexandra, thank you, because you've given us an opportunity to also reflect upon the evolution of museum life and collections, which have an imperial slant or might not have an imperial slant because of the personality and wisdom and intelligence of the museum director. And having said that, we've come to recognize that Roitburt was a very intelligent person, and he knew his history, and he came out of this period of contemporary Ukrainian art where the clash between Russia and Ukraine was really forefronted. And so it was very, very clever of him to put as a backdrop this particular portrait, this copy of a painting that Levitsky did when he was still in St. Petersburg, because it is an allegory. It was titled an allegory. It's the allegory of Catherine the Great as legislatress in the Palace of Justice. But when you look at that painting, the goddess of justice is not blindfolded, as the classic imagery would have us understand. And the scales that she's holding are tilted. They're out of balance. They're out of kilter. So it's like the last laugh that Levitsky had as a good Ukrainian who was, yes, definitely raised by an elite family. And he came back to Ukraine to live out his life. He knew what he was doing, but he was living in an era of imperialism. And he had to use his talents. We use our talents, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, because that's what expresses us. But that portrait is iconic of sticking it to the empire, sticking it to Catherine. So it has nothing to do with imperial lineage. It has everything to do with Ukrainian attitude toward the Tsars, toward the Empress. And so I think it's a victory for Roitburt, it's a victory for Odessa, and it is further evidence of the fact that the leaders of these breakaway republics, or so-called independent or autonomous republics, they have no clue whatsoever where the heart of the nation, of the Ukrainian nation, lies. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much for that comment. And yes, it was a very important part of our each excursion we had in the museum, speaking about the Levitsky portrait. This thing that you mentioned about the scales and the eyes of and the dress, etc., etc. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Yuliia Vaganova.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Miroslava, for this point, this message. Because actually, when I saw this photo of these so-called leaders in front of the Levitsky portrait, I saw that maybe it's a very bad understanding and very bad copy of the one cinema of the Sorrentino El Dio, when they all images and all actually sent, making in front of the big pictures with some symbolic and, but of course, very artistic view. In this situation, it's absolutely another one. I would like also to add something. Actually, when we are talking about the place of of this author or this author, we already had some experience in it. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult for the museum move with this agenda, because I remember that in 2015, in the National Art Museum of Ukraine, we've done the exhibition which called Heroes, the attempt of the inventarization, when I was in the curatorial team of the exhibition. And then we just make the inventarization of our collection and try to find out what heroes do we have in the collection. And in this exhibition, you will find everyone. I mean, starting from the Science Church, finishing with Lenin and Stalin, and the last hero, which was founded actually in the collection, which was presented as a hero with the all canonic sense of the hero, was one of the firemen who saved people and who were working after the Chernobyl catastrophe. And this was very big challenge for the museum, because we have to show Stalin and Lenin, but somehow only 1 or 2 persons were claimed to the museum that we show Lenin and Stalin sculptures and pictures. When you show it when you do not make the propaganda, but to show it just another one heroes, which somehow happened in the museum, for example, then the people understand very, very good and raise the question in a very interesting and very critical way about who is a hero, who is not a hero. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. All of the talks have been fantastic, so thank you. I'm not sure whether my question really warrants the seriousness where the conversation is going at the moment, but I was particularly taken by, Tamina, your reference to the I'm not going to pronounce this properly, Tarawiti Museum in New Zealand, and the reference there to the indigenous cultures and especially the Maori culture there. And I suppose I have a question for the wider panel, which is about, I'm quite interested in the indigenous communities that live in Ukraine, and I'm thinking, I suppose, of the Tatars, Hutsuls, Cossacks, Boykos. I'm sure there are others. I'm quite interested in how their identity fits with the wider Ukrainian identity and how that's represented in museums as well. I'm not sure who to direct that at.
Difficult question.
I can, before Alexandra and Yulia make their mind, I can just comment briefly that according to Ukrainian legislature, we have 3 indigenous people in Ukraine, actually 4. So let's say the majority is Ukrainians, and then we have Crimean Tatars, Karaims, and Krimchaks. So the 3 indigenous people that inhabited Crimea originally. So they are considered. The others, I don't think that they are considered indigenous people.
And I have to say that during the 31 year of independence, only after the Maidan revolution, we felt that finally culture became more visible and more important for the state. And it happened only because we've chosen our vector of development, and it wasn't towards Russia. If we were going towards Russia after 2014, the cultural development would have been suppressed as it was before that, as again, we lived in under huge influence of Russian Federation, even after the gaining independence. And these pro-Russian politicians or Communist Party that continued to exist in Ukraine for some time. And during that time, the meaning of museum was devaluated in a way. And we had to build it again. And I speak about the cultural managers who worked in Ukraine during past like 10 years and became visible. They worked even before, but during this time after Maidan revolution, culture became visible, cultural managers became visible, and museums became visible, but not all of the museums. And unfortunately, for many museums in Ukraine, it is actually a great start to have their expositions taken away, because it's a blank list and it's a blank piece of paper they can now work on. But of course, we will need a lot of internal discussions, trainings, I don't know, rethinking, and making new exhibitions. But of course, after 2014, a lot of projects, at least linked with the Crimean Tatars, were held in many museums of Ukraine. And of course, we always spoke about it. And one of the things that Roodbuurt would get out of the basement would be everything that is somehow linked to Crimean Tatars.
Thank you. Thank you. And forgive me, I may have misunderstood, but so with the, obviously, as Tetyana mentioned, that the Tatars are recognized as an indigenous culture. So does that mean that Hutsuls and Cossacks, are they considered from a different territory, or?
I just looked up, and they are called sub-ethnic groups or ethnographic groups of Ukrainian people. So they are not considered a separate ethnicity. They're a sub-ethnic group of Ukrainians. Hutsuls, Boyki, all the other kind of types of Ukrainian people. So there are minorities like, for example, Greek minority or Russian minority, or I don't know, Armenian and German, etc., etc. There are indigenous people that we counted, and they are based in Crimea, and there are sub-ethnic groups.
Thank you.
I would like to tell that actually several years ago, when I used to work in Mistecki Arsenal, we made one project which called Miracle Stories of the Crimea. Дивовижні, Таня, допоможи мені з перекладом. Крим, дивовижні історії.
Fantastic.
Okay, Miracle Stories of Crimea. It was another one title. I'm sorry, I forgot the exact title. And then we tried actually to talk about the story of Crimea and to present how it was from the beginning, for many years ago, how it has all the time the connection with the present territory of Ukraine, and it was not disconnected as a separate territory. Moreover, it's all the time till the Katarzyna came. It used to be the territory of really very different cultures and interchange between the cultures. And only when Katarzyna came, actually, it was the process of unification of culture and erasing all other actually cultural groups and diversities. So this question actually bringing it up to the agenda of Ukrainian cultural institutions and museums. What is important, I think, it's really not to build the separate exposition of Crimean Tatars or other minorities, but to show how they together collaborating with Ukrainian culture. This is something what I'm talking when I'm explaining about the importance of the Khanenko Museum. When you don't have Ukrainian art in the collection, but you have Asian collection and Islamic, and you have Western European collection. So what is the importance of the museum for the Ukraine, for example, especially in the war period? It's only because that when you have only one monoculture, it will be capsulated, it will be all the time come to the end and will not produce any more new senses or new ideas. Only when you're collaborating with other culture, but not adopt it, because it doesn't work. Only in collaboration with other culture, you produce something new senses, new ideas, new culture. So it's important not to make the separation museum of Crimean Tatars or Kazakhs or Hutsuls, but really to make such a project which will show the collaboration and influence one culture to another one, and as a result, the richness of the Ukrainian cultures and cultures of these nations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuliia. Tetyana?
Yeah, I just wanted to just expand more for Maria on the Aotearoa New Zealand case at Tairāwhiti Museum, and actually more generally in Kiwi museum culture. What surprised me, and I really also endorse what Yuliia's just said, there are issues around the binary of the European colonizers, mainly British, and the indigenous Maori culture. And what you will hear a lot in terms of government cultural policy is biculturalism. And I was quite sort of taken aback. What do you mean biculturalism? So European and Maori. What about everyone else? New Zealand is a massively diverse country now and has been for a couple of 100 years. Where do they fit into being Kiwi or being from Aotearoa New Zealand? And that's why I do also think it's really important not to, because it's actually a very colonial part of the colonial project, which is to classify people and give them labels. And what I was really impressed by in Estonia at the new Estonian National Museum is that they didn't do that. The diversity was definitely there, and the diversity of experience and all of those contradictions were there. They were all present, but they weren't compartmentalized. And you know, compared to our museums here in the UK, which still categorizes and classifies anyone other than themselves, it's a very it was a very welcome museum to experience. And you know, if anyone here hasn't yet visited Tartu, you must go. So I think there's a way that a museum can carry this off, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of commitment for that equity absolutely across the board. And I don't think I think New Zealand are doing great things, but they certainly haven't got it absolutely right, in my view.
Thank you, everyone. That's really useful to know and really refreshing. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like now to read a question from our online audience. It's from Maria Silina, University of Quebec in Montreal. My first question is to Alexandra Kovalchuk. You have briefly mentioned the division of the Odessa Fine Arts Museum collections after the 1917 revolution and the current plans to claim restitution of some of these alienated objects. Can you talk a little bit more about it? Thank you. The same question to Yuliia Vaganova. Your thoughts about restitution claims as part of the decolonization strategy for Ukrainian museums? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. To make myself clear about the division of collections, I don't think the Odessa Fine Arts Museum has to claim any art from the Museum of Western and Eastern Art. However, together with Royboard, we were on board of the idea of rejoining these two museums and creating a museum that would host all kinds of art, like returning to the beginning point, joining the two museums together. And maybe at some point it will happen, but not yet. As for the restitution itself, there are different points of view, and even in somewhere in March or April, we were talking with my colleague, and we had a little quarrel about the decolonization and restitution. Because for me, speaking broader about decolonization, it was always following certain pattern, and restitution not to the museums but to the families of people who own some object in our collection. And if you will look at the Odessa Fine Arts Museum collection, among our best sellers highlights that all people adore because it's big and bright, and that's usually what people enjoy most in our collection. It would be something that we will have to give away. And it will be, of course, I hope that in this giving away would be an opportunity to buy it or to gain it on a legal platform legally, and then the community will decide what community wants to hold on to, and what has to go away. And I'm not afraid of this process if we're speaking about giving away works of art that were received by the museum not in a legal way during the Soviet Union time. And another problem of restitution that we have is that we have limited information in our case about the works of art that were looted from our museum to Western Europe. And I'm sure that most of these works of art still exist. And because we don't have inventory books related to that time, we cannot claim for sure what that was, but we know for sure that was like a couple of trucks of things that were taken away at the Odessa Fine Arts Museum. So that's my view on the problem of restitution.
I will follow to Alexandra. So that's actually, yeah, this is the two questions. Actually, it's a question of the justice also. And this, if we pretend as an institution that justice is it's something which is important for us and for our country when we are in war now, and we pretend on it. So of course, after we win this war, it has to be raised the question about justice, not only to our works, but to works of others, for example. And this will be quite a difficult discussion and quite difficult difficult process, I'm sure, but we have to go through it. At the same time, as Alexandra mentioned, we also have a lot of works which are were lost or stolen from the museum. Some of them, for example, were even returned during the last 10 years. But there are some examples which, for example, I could imagine will be quite difficult to talk and to find the solution. For example, we have books of the registration from Khanenko time, actually, the safes, and they have original books of the registration. Of course, the information there are not all the time clear, and some of the works were reattributed because Khanenko bought it as another author, but unfortunately, then later they were reattributed. But nevertheless, for example, we have one of the very nice objects from Islamic art, which disappeared in the beginning of the 20s when the Bolsheviks came actually, and it was lost. But then suddenly in 30s, it appears in Hermitage Museum, and it was never came back to Khanenko unless actually the main chief curator, Serhiy Hilarov, who made actually together with Varvara Khanenko the first exposition. They stated that this is object from Khanenko Museum, and it's clear and it's seen on the photographs, but now it's in Hermitage and it never came back. Or another story, Serhiy Hilarov found in one of the churches in Kyiv the diptych of the Kranach, Adam and Eve, and he attributed this diptych as a Kranach's work. And it was actually confirmed by many researchers in Europe that this is Kranach diptych. And we have on the photos, archive photos, this diptych in our museum. But again, Soviets taken away this diptych from the museum, and then have продали, Таня, я перепрошую, я просто stolen. Sorry? Stolen, yes. So, sorry. And then they stolen it on the auction in the end of the 20s, where a lot of another artworks were stolen. But it was fine. Sorry?
They sold it. They sold it.
Oh, sorry. Yes, they sold it out on the auction. where a lot, it was a big auction in the end of the 20th, I guess, when a lot of artworks from the collections, from private collections, which were nationalized and from the museum were sold out to the Europe to get the money to the new Soviet country. And actually this diptych was written not like came from the Khanenko museum, but was written that it was in another private collection and was sold out on the auction. And then it goes to the Austria. You could find this. Then the next part of the story you can find in internet in English, because it was sold. It was sold out to the one of the Austrian lawyer, and then Nazis took it away from this lawyer, and then finally this work goes to the Pasadena Museum. So we have now in Pasadena Museum diptych by Kranach, which originally was in the Khanenko Museum. So how we will deal with this situation, how we will do with this diptych, which we have on our photos as a diptych from the collection of Khanenko. So that's why I think that this is very intriguing and very great question, which actually we have to raise to all museum world community, how to deal with it and how to resolve this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, yes, these cases are so numerous. I just visited V&A Museum the other week, and I saw a beautiful golden gates from the church, and I immediately knew that it was related to Ukraine somehow. And it did. It was some gates from Kyiv Lavra that were bought in the 30s. And I would be really interested to know, who bought it from whom and how they, ended up being not in the church in Kyiv Lavra, but elsewhere. Maybe they were even from this Uspensky Cathedral, which was blown up by eventually Soviets, not the Germans as we knew it from the Soviet history books. We actually have just a little bit time left. Katarzyna, your turn, and then maybe a few closing remarks, and we'll be finishing today's conversation.
I just wanted to ask a question to Yuliia. The photograph, which actually announces our session, includes some wonderful Italian paintings. And I wonder whether those paintings, as the central one looks like Paris Bourdonnais or some allegorical scene. I wonder whether this painting still belongs to the collection of the museum, or is it one of those works which is lost? The largest.
Sorry, because I just cannot so quickly to switch on to the announcement. Sorry for it.
Okay, so I will ask.
Maybe I will write you. Yeah, I will find this photo and I will write you later.
So I won't take time. I just wanted to say that there are ways of, I think there must be ways, because the National Museum in Warsaw had quite a lot of cases where the work of art would be found in another collection or even in another museum, or perhaps another museum would a work from another museum in Europe would be found in the collection of the National Museum in Warsaw. So all those things where there are, I cannot tell you now which institutions deal with that, but there are some ways. The Ministry of Culture should have some contacts with some contacts which facilitate this process of restitution.
If we have a moment to say some final words, I wanted to make a note of this suggestion that we should visit Museum in Tartu if we didn't. And I thought how different that is for our perspective, like me sitting in Boston and waiting for documents from the immigration center that would allow me to go out of the United States and then to return to my family and baby who stays here, because I really want to go to Ukraine for a week to visit the museum. And I'm waiting for this document that I can receive somewhere between in month or in 15 months, because that's how American bureaucracy works. And I see Julia, who is absolutely exhausted by her trip and free conferences, I think that she attended during the week, and how easy it would have been 2 years ago or a year ago, connecting from Odessa directly to many countries, many cities of the world in no time. And now the distance and the idea of traveling changed so much for us. The only thing that I wish that this painful experience that we are going through stays with us and doesn't spread further through the world, because I really believe that we are on the edge when everyone can experience what we're experiencing now. Everyone can experience it in the close future, unfortunately. And I wish that wouldn't happen. And I would appreciate any effort you would do personally to avoid this terrible future for the world. Thank you. Sorry for a pessimistic note.
No, I think it really keeps us motivated in doing even more than we do. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, for your effort, for your contributions to these events, to these discussions. I think we are finishing this particular event or project, but we are moving on into many others. And Maria just mentioned the series of discussion we will have together with the ICOM UK and the ICOM Ukraine and Ukrainian institutes in both Kyiv and London, which will follow up on many of the issues that were raised during these 2 days of conversations. And I really hope we will continue working with the Museums Association, with the Birkbeck Center for Museum Cultures and all the partners and British Council to move on to discuss more and to also do other practical instruments, develop practical instruments to implement those things that we talked about, to continue collaboration between different countries to maintain the ideas and principles of international cultural organizations, also, in order to prevent the collapse of all the systems that we were able to construct and build within the 20th century to actually make the better future, not the worse for us. I would like to thank again the Birkbeck Center and the British Council for organizing this series of events, for everyone who made it happen. And I wish you all being safe in yourself and your families, and Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Дякую.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.
So much. That was
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
very moving. And